Forget about those overhyped, multi-billion-dollar stealth fighters. Right now, the skies are being torn apart by a 70-year-old flying monster, a roar so terrifying that even submarine crews deep underwater tremble in panic. How does this ancient hunk of scrap metal with peeling paint make entire continents nervous and have NATO generals stuttering? It's not just an airplane, it's an acoustic nightmare and the most audacious slap in the face to modern aviation. Our hero today is the Tu-95, known by the call sign Bear. Why do they absolutely refuse to send this gray-haired legend to the scrapyard? What secret do its supersonic meat grinder propellers hide? And how does this roaring anomaly single-handedly humiliate the elite air forces of the Western world? I've dug up the details I'm dying to share with you. Watch this video to the very last second, and I'll explain why this pensioner aircraft still annoys everyone. Let's not delay, let's get started. North Sea, November, 10,000 meters. Two British Royal Air Force pilots receive an interception command. The radar shows a target, large, slow, and absolutely self-assured. They pick up speed, they close in, and then they hear it. Not see, they hear it. Through pressurized cockpits, through the roar of their own jet engines, through thick headsets. A deep, pulsing, unparalleled hum, as if the sky itself started to vibrate. Then they see it. Enormous, impossibly huge for something capable of flight. 4 engines, 8 colossal blades churning the air with such force that the sound can be heard for dozens of kilometers. No stealth, no attempt to hide. It just flies, openly, unhurriedly, as if it couldn't care less who is watching. One pilot would later write in his report a simple phrase: "Looks like a relic, behaves like an owner." That was the Tu-95. And at that time, the aircraft was already over 40 years old. Now, it's over 70, and it's still flying. Imagine a noisy party. Modern, sleek, incredibly expensive machines are milling about. 5th-generation fighters, stealth jets that no radar can track. They discuss whose onboard computer is better, pretending to be very busy. Then, the door bursts open with a bang. Standing on the threshold is him. Gray. Massive. With 4 propellers, peeling paint, and a roar that knocks glasses off the tables. Everyone looks at each other. He's here again. But you can't ignore him, because this plane survived the collapse of an entire empire. It outlived several generations of its intended replacements, and it survived countless official statements about its imminent retirement. Meet the Tu-95, NATO codename Bear, the loudest strategic aircraft in the world, the longest lived, and perhaps the most underestimated. Today, we're going to break it down completely. Where it came from, why its engines can be heard deep underwater, what happened in October 1961 when it carried out the most incredible sortie in aviation history, and why, in the age of hypersonics and artificial intelligence, this propeller-driven plane still makes entire governments nervous. It doesn't hide. It screams its presence to the entire world, and that is its main secret. But to understand how this is even possible, we need to look back at the era that birthed it. 1945, when 2 titans looked at each other across the ocean and realized they were now alone. The planet exhales. 6 years of global conflict are behind us. Cities are in ruins. Entire nations are counting their losses. Everyone wants one thing: peace, silence, a normal life. But 2 men look at the world map and think of something else. In Washington and Moscow, around the same time, the same realization dawns. The old world order has collapsed. Only 2 remain, and each knows the other is thinking exactly the same. This isn't paranoia. This is geometry. When only 2 centers of power remain on the planet, they inevitably start measuring the distance between them. And the first question every military strategist asks in such a situation is simple: how far can the enemy reach? For the Soviet Union, the answer to that question in 1945 was alarming. The US possessed the B-29 bomber, the one that proved it could strike on the other side of the planet. The USSR had almost no long-range aviation of that class. Imagine a chess game where one player has a queen and the other does not. This is not just inconvenient. It means the entire strategy is built on someone else's terms. And thus began one of the most interesting technical marathons of the 20th century. The Soviet Union urgently set out to create its own strategic bomber, capable of crossing the ocean, carrying a serious payload, and returning home. 3 requirements, each individually a complex engineering task. All 3 together, nearly impossible. Almost. At first, Soviet designers followed an obvious path. Captured German designs were meticulously studied. Several American B-29s, having made emergency landings on Soviet territory during the Pacific conflict, were carefully examined. Based on them, the Tu-4 was urgently created, the first Soviet long-range bomber. But it was only a temporary solution. The B-29 was already outdated, and in the US, the development of a new giant was in full swing, the B-36 Peacemaker. 6 piston engines, then 4 jets added on top. Range, over 11,000 kilometers. Ceiling, 14,000 meters. Soviet fighters of that time simply couldn't reach it. That's when the real race began. And here is something usually left out of standard reviews. Soviet designers at the time had practically no independent experience in building planes of this class. Everything done before was either copied or designed with an eye on foreign solutions. Now, they had to design something fundamentally new, from scratch, under the crushing resource constraints of a post-war country. And they had less than 5 years. 5 years is very little, given the scale of the task. It's like being told, build a new city, from scratch, with its own infrastructure, supply systems, and unique technologies, by next spring. A man whose biography is a gripping story in itself took on the challenge. Andrei Tupolev, a designer who had already created several legendary planes, who went through an arrest and spent several years in a sharashka, a closed design bureau within a penal institution, where scientists worked in total isolation from the outside world, and who, upon release, continued his work with the same methodical precision and engineering passion, a man who couldn't be broken. He received a task many considered unreal, and he proposed a solution that everyone initially thought was madness. But that was only the first of several crazy ideas that eventually changed aviation. Imagine a meeting. Moscow, early 1950s. People in uniforms and suits sit around a long table. Blueprints, calculations, and graphs are laid out. On the wall, a map with distances marked. From Moscow to Washington. From Moscow to New York. Figures no one in that room says out loud, but everyone sees. The only item on the agenda. What will power the plane? This sounds simple, but behind it lies an engineering dilemma that will define everything else. Each technical decision is a chain of consequences. You choose an engine, and you automatically get range, speed, altitude, and fuel consumption. Change the engine, and the whole plane changes. By then, a new era in aviation was beginning. Jet engines were rapidly pushing everything else aside. They provided speed. They provided altitude. They looked like the future, and for the most part, they were. The logical choice was obvious: jet engines. Tupolev chose something else. He proposed putting turboprop engines on the new strategic aircraft, the ones with massive rotating blades, a technology many considered yesterday's news, obsolete. Inappropriate for a machine aiming to be the country's main strategic tool. The room, they say, fell silent. Turboprops? Someone asked. Turboprops, Tupolev confirmed. On a strategic bomber? Precisely on it. To understand why this seemed like madness, and why it was actually brilliant, you have to understand a fundamental fact. Flight range is not just about how much fuel you carry. It's about how fast you burn it. A jet engine on long distances is a glutton. It delivers incredible thrust and accelerates the plane to fantastic speeds. But fuel flows through it like a river. In cruise mode, at high altitudes, during long flights, this is a critical flaw. A turboprop engine behaves fundamentally differently. It is economical, calculated, methodically economical. Like a good accountant who knows that every resource counts. Tupolev understood this. He bet not on speed, but on endurance. This was the choice of a strategist, not a racer. But there was one problem. Turboprop engines of the necessary power did not exist in the USSR at that time. They had to be created. Simultaneously with the design of the plane. Simultaneously with everything else. The task for engine development went to designer Nikolai Kuznetsov, a man now called one of the most outstanding aviation engineers of the Soviet era. His name is borne by the engine eventually put on the Bear, the NK-12. But before we get to the engine, we have to talk about Tupolev himself. Because without understanding this man, it's impossible to understand why the project survived. Andrei Tupolev was already a legend. Not an official legend, not a portrait on the wall, but a living, active, slightly frightening legend. A man who knew everything about airplanes and wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even when it was dangerous. In 1937, he was arrested, without explanation, without a real trial. One day they came for him, and he vanished from normal life for almost 6 years. He ended up in the system of closed design bureaus, where scientists worked under guard, isolated from families, from the world, from any information they weren't supposed to have. In those conditions, many broke. Tupolev kept working. It was there, under those conditions, that he created several aircraft that entered service and were used in real operations. He designed machines he later saw only in newspaper photos, if the newspapers reached him at all. In 1941, he was released, because the country urgently needed his brain at liberty. And this man, with such experience, with such character, in the early 1950s, stands before the task of creating a plane with no analogs. He didn't hesitate. While technical debates raged about engines, while commissions discussed the advantages of jet thrust, Tupolev was calculating. The numbers told him what others didn't want to hear. At a given range and load, the turboprop variant wins. Not in speed, in the main indicator. In the ability to complete the mission and return. Ultimately, the decision was made. Turboprop engines, swept-back wings, a fundamentally new layout. A plane that would not be the fastest, but the most enduring. The first flight took place in November 1952, and something happened that almost no one expected. It took off, and they heard it. Not just heard it. The sound the new plane's engines made was so unusual, so physically palpable, that operators at the airfield instinctively stepped away from the edge of the runway. Not because there was a regulation, but because this sound demanded a respectful distance. No one knew then that this sound would become one of the most recognizable in aviation history, an acoustic symbol of an entire era. While some argued about engines, another competition was unfolding. A competition that wasn't spoken of out loud. The competition for whose plane was louder. And here, the Bear won with such a gap that it stopped being funny. Close your eyes and imagine the following. You were standing on the edge of the runway. 100 meters away stands a Tu-95. Its engines have just been started. As they ramp up to speed, you hear a low, primal hum. It doesn't come from your ears. It comes from your chest, from your gut, as if the very air around you has started to change density. Then the engines reach full power, and you realize that the word loud doesn't do it justice. It isn't loud, it's physical. The vibration passes through the soles of your shoes, travels up your legs, and reaches your teeth. People around you open their mouths, not to say anything, but just to equalize the pressure. Like in a plane during descent, only in reverse. This is the NK-12 engine. And before talking about the numbers, which are absolutely fantastic, you have to understand one thing. Nikolai Kuznetsov, who created this engine, was solving a problem that had no ready-made answer. He had to create a turboprop engine of such power that it had never existed in nature. Not improve an existing one, not adapt a foreign one, create a fundamentally new one. He did it. The NK-12 delivers 15,000 horsepower. Each engine. There are 4 of them on the Tu-95. 15,000 horsepower is an abstract figure if you don't convert it to something understandable. Let's convert it. The most powerful production car engine in the world puts out about 1,000 horsepower, and that's already considered beyond reason. The NK-12 is 15 times more powerful. One engine out of 4. Together, they pull like 60 of the most powerful sports cars simultaneously. But power is only half the story. The second half is how this power is transferred to the air. And this is where it gets interesting. A standard turboprop engine spins one propeller. The NK-12 spins 2 at once, on the same shaft in opposite directions. This is called a contra-rotating coaxial scheme. 2 massive propellers, each nearly 6 meters in diameter, rotate towards each other on the same axis. The front one pulls. The rear one captures the turbulence from the front and turns it into additional thrust. The efficiency of such a system is significantly higher than that of a single propeller. You're probably thinking, sounds reasonable, what's the problem? The problem is the rotational speed. At cruise speed, the tips of these propeller blades move faster than the speed of sound. Not the whole propeller, just the tips. They break the sound barrier continuously, at every moment of flight. And every time a blade passes that point, it creates a small sonic shock impulse. 8 blades on the front propeller, 8 on the back, 4 engines, all simultaneously. The result is a continuous, pulsing sound wave of incredible intensity. Not just noise, a wave. Physical, tangible. That's why this sound is heard for 40 kilometers on a clear day. That's why hydroacoustic stations on submarines, while submerged, recorded it when the bear flew over the ocean surface. The sound born in the air passed through the water's surface and traveled into the depths, as if the plane were announcing its presence in 2 elements at once. This is not a legend, it's a documented acoustic phenomenon. But here is what engineers didn't want to admit publicly for a long time. The sound of the NK-12 engines at certain frequencies, low, infrasonic, causes a feeling of physical discomfort to people nearby. Not just annoyance from noise, a physical feeling, light nausea, pressure in the head, an instinctive desire to move away. This is not a design accident. It's a consequence of that pulsing wave from the contra-rotating propellers. At certain modes, it hits a range to which the human body reacts autonomously, without consciousness. The plane's crews, by the way, work in constant acoustic noise. Hearing protection is mandatory. Veterans who have flown thousands of hours on the Tu-95 all say one thing: you don't get used to this sound, you just learn to live with it. Now, about the records. The NK-12 remains, even 70 years later, the most powerful turboprop engine in aviation history. No one has surpassed it. Not because they didn't try. It just turned out that creating something more powerful, while maintaining acceptable dimensions and reliability, is extremely difficult. It's like a high jump record that has stood for decades. Everyone knows it exists. Everyone theoretically understands how to break it. But in practice, no one has succeeded. And one more fact that changes the entire perception of this plane. The Tu-95 is the only turboprop in the world with a cruise speed of over 800 kilometers per hour. 800 kilometers per hour is jet territory. Every textbook says a turboprop shouldn't work at such speeds. Physics says no. The bear flies. This contradiction, near jet speed, turboprop efficiency, is the main engineering trick Tupolev built into it. He found a narrow window where these two qualities coexist, and he hit it precisely. This engine is not just the heart of the plane. It is its personality, its character, what makes it unique and irreplaceable at the same time. But the bear's most important sortie was still to come. A flight after which the whole world understood. This isn't just a plane. This is a statement. October 1961. The Novaya Zemlya archipelago, and a payload that doesn't fit into any conventional category. October 30th, 1961. 11:32 a.m. Moscow time. Over the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, a desolate chain of islands in the Arctic Ocean, where there is nothing but tundra, ice, and polar wind, something happens for which people of that time had no words. A flash. Not just a bright flash. A flash seen from 1,000 kilometers away. In clear weather. in broad daylight. Then, a sphere, a fireball almost 5 kilometers in diameter that rose to an altitude of 60 kilometers, higher than normal planes fly, higher than the stratosphere, almost at the edge of space. Then, the shockwave. It circled the globe 3 times. 3 times. Seismographs around the world recorded the tremor that didn't come from the ground. It came from the air. Specialists couldn't understand what happened. Instruments showed values for which no rows existed in existing tables. At the epicenter, where it all happened, there wasn't a single person. Only tundra, only ice, only cliffs. And one plane did all this. But let's go back a few hours, because the story of this flight doesn't start with the flash. It starts early in the morning at Olynya Airfield in the Murmansk region, where a crew led by Major Andrei Tupolev did what all pilots do before a flight: check the plane. Only the plane wasn't quite ordinary. This was a specially modified Tu-95V. It had been prepared for this mission for years. Everything unnecessary was removed to reduce weight and free up space. The exterior surfaces were covered in white, light-reflecting paint, not for beauty, so the crew would have at least some chance. Under the fuselage, on a special mount, hung the payload. Its weight was 27 tons, length 8 meters, diameter 2 meters. It didn't physically fit in the bomb bay. The bay had to be rebuilt, removing the doors and installing external mounts. This was the AN-602 device. People call it the Tsar Bomba. The calculated power of the explosion was 50 megatons in TNT equivalent. 50 million tons of TNT. For comparison, all explosives used in World War II by all sides combined total approximately 2 megatons. The Tsar Bomba was 25 times more powerful than the entire Second World War. Think about that figure. One plane, one payload, 25 world wars in one device. Now you understand why the plane was painted white. Physicists and engineers calculated honestly. Upon detonation at 4,000 meters, light and heat radiation of such power could damage or destroy a plane even at a significant distance. So, the payload was equipped with a special parachute system. A massive braking parachute had to slow the fall so the plane could reach a safe distance. The calculated time from release to detonation, 45 seconds. In that time, the plane had to cover at least 45 kilometers. Theoretically, that should have been enough. Theoretically. The crew knew the calculations. The crew knew the chance of not returning was about 50%. This isn't an exaggeration or a beautiful legend. It's a real estimate they were told before takeoff. Light radiation, shockwave, possible loss of control, everything was calculated and stated up front. They took off. The plane climbed to 10,000 meters, cruising speed, course to the drop point. In the cabin, silence, broken only by the familiar roar of engines and protocol communications with the ground. Aircraft Commander Andrei Tupolev was calm. People who knew him later said he rarely raised his voice. He just did what needed to be done. Below them drifted the tundra of Novaya Zemlya, desolate, endless, white. At 11:32 a.m., the navigator pressed the release button. 27 tons detached from the mount. The plane instantly became lighter and surged upward. Tupolev held the machine, banked at maximum speed, and began to pull away. Full engine power. The NK-12 roared so that it seemed the air itself would crack. 45 seconds. Each of them, surely, was very long. At the 42nd second, the flash. Even behind goggles with maximum tinting, several crew members were momentarily blinded. Then came the light. White. Total. As if someone had turned on a second sun right behind the plane. Then, the shockwave. The plane was thrown down nearly 1,000 meters. Tu-95 regained control. They returned to base. All of them. Already on the ground, a technician walked up to the plane and ran a hand over the fuselage. The white paint was scorched and peeling in places, despite the 45-kilometer distance and the protective coating. Thermal radiation reached even there. What happened at the point of detonation, we know from instruments and photos taken by observation planes. Cliffs within a radius of several kilometers were literally smoothed by the shockwave. The tundra became like a polished table. The mushroom cloud rose to 60 kilometers and spread for hundreds of kilometers. The explosion was registered by every seismograph on the planet. Norway, Alaska, Japan, everywhere, instruments recorded the anomaly. World media the next day ran with huge headlines. Governments demanded explanations. Scientists recalculated their models. And in Moscow, photos were placed on the desk. A white plane on the runway, the crew nearby, everyone alive. The Tu-95 had just completed the most incredible sortie in aviation history, and became part of a history that the planet will never forget. But here is what is important to understand. This flight was an exception, a one-time, limit-pushing event. All the rest of the time, the bear did other work. Daily, methodical. The kind that doesn't make the front pages of newspapers, but forms the real balance in the world. Patrolling. Intercepts. A game of cat and mouse over 3 oceans at once. And here begins, perhaps, the most human part of this story. Somewhere over the North Sea. 1970s. Altitude 9,000 meters. A British pilot in a Phantom fighter receives a short command via radio. Target detected. Course is such and such. Speed is such and such. Move out. He turns the machine and approaches. The first thing he hears is the hum. The very same, signature one. Deep, pulsing, like nothing else. Then, out of the gray mist over the sea, a silhouette slowly emerges. Huge, unhurried, absolutely imperturbable. The bear is flying west. The Briton pulls up alongside. Standard procedure. Closing in. Visual contact. Escort. Photography. Everything by protocol worked out to automation. And then, the Soviet navigator in his cabin turns his head, looks at the interceptor, lifts a hand, and waves. The British pilot is lost for a second. Then, he waves back. 2 pilots from 2 different worlds, officially on opposite sides of a global confrontation, waving to each other at 9,000 meters above a cold northern sea. Like neighbors over a fence on a Sunday morning. This isn't fiction. This is a documented tradition that existed for decades. Pilots are a separate caste. They have their own rules, their own code, their own understanding of respect. And when 2 professionals end up side by side in the sky, it doesn't matter what flags they fly. Something emerges between them that is hard to call anything other than mutual recognition. Soviet Tu-95 crews clocked tens of thousands of hours over oceans. This was their work. Daily, methodical, physically exhausting work. Flights lasted 18, 20, sometimes 24 hours. Routes spanned the Atlantic, the Pacific, along the shores of Alaska, along the Norwegian coast. And on almost every route, sooner or later, they appeared. Interceptors. American F-4s, then F-14, then F-15. British Lightnings, then Phantoms, then Tornadoes. Norwegian F-16, Japanese F-4 EJs. Each with its own style of approach, its own protocol, its own character. Soviet navigators and flight engineers eventually learned to recognize their handwriting. The Americans approached sharply, aggressively, demonstratively, with the intent to impress. They came from different angles, showed off their weaponry, held close. Professional, but with character. The British were calmer, more methodical. They stayed on the side, did their job, photographed, recorded, escorted, and held position only until the bear turned. The Norwegians, veterans say, were the most polite. And now, about the most famous incident of this kind. One of those that didn't make official reports, but was retold in flight canteens on both sides. Late 1970s, Pacific Ocean. An American aircraft carrier is performing scheduled exercises. On the radars, a target. Large, slow. Course straight for the carrier group. Interceptors are scrambled. Standard procedure. Escort. Everything by protocol. Then, the bear begins to descend. The interceptors follow. 1,000 meters. 500. 300. The Soviet plane goes into a low-level pass over the carrier's deck. Literally over it. At an altitude later estimated at a few dozen meters. So low that the sailors on the deck instinctively ducked from the roar of the engines. The onboard photographer on the Tu-95 was shooting the whole time. In the photos that later appeared in Soviet military archives, you can distinguish individual faces of sailors on the deck, looking up, with very expressive faces. The bear climbed and set a return course, without a single shot, without a single aggressive maneuver. Just flew in, looked, took photos, and flew away, like a tourist. A very large, very loud tourist with a very serious camera. That is the essence of what the Tu-95 did for most of its life. Not destruction. Presence. Its very appearance over a certain area of the ocean was a message. Clear, unambiguous, requiring no translation. We are here. We see you. We can fly in whenever we want. And no stealth technology is needed for that. On the contrary, the more noticeable, the louder, the more convincing the message. NATO developed standard intercept procedures for the Tu-95 in the 1950s. Since then, these procedures have been updated, refined, and adapted many times, but the essence remained the same. Upon detection, interceptors are scrambled. Visual contact is made. The target is followed until it exits the area of interest. For 70 years, this has happened hundreds of times. Hundreds of interceptor sorties, hundreds of flight hours, fuel, maintenance, pilot time, radar operator work. All these are real costs incurred by NATO countries every time the bear hits its route. One plane, built in the 1950s, forces the largest military alliance on the planet to regularly spend resources just to keep an eye on it. This is not a military operation. This is an expensive ritual that has lasted for 7 decades. And this ritual continues right now. While you are watching this video, somewhere over the North Sea or the Pacific, in all likelihood, another bear is out there. Methodically, unhurriedly, with navigation lights on. And somewhere nearby, another interceptor is pulling up. Standard procedure. Everything by protocol. But while some in NATO headquarters were counting the costs of these intercepts, others were asking a question that sooner or later had to be asked. If this plane is so valuable, why every few years does someone announce that it is about to be scrapped? And why does it never happen? There's a special genre of documents. It's called a write-off act. It's a boring piece of paper with bureaucratic language, seals, and signatures. It says roughly the following. This unit of equipment has exhausted its resource, is morally and physically obsolete. Further operation is inexpedient. Transfer to a museum, or for disposal, or just put it under the open sky to rust. They wrote such papers for the Tu-95 several times. None of them worked. The first time they talked about the bear's inevitable end was in the late 1950s. Jet aviation was developing rapidly. It seemed obvious. The turboprop dinosaur wouldn't last long. It would be replaced by something more modern. It wasn't replaced. In the 1960s, work began on the Tu-160, a supersonic strategic bomber that was supposed to be the true successor. Fast, powerful, menacing. The White Swan, as it would later be called. The bear, it seemed, was living its last years. The Tu-160 did appear. It is beautiful. It is indeed faster, higher, and in many respects, more perfect. They still didn't scrap the bear, because a simple thing became clear. The Tu-160 is magnificent for high-speed penetration, but it cannot loiter over the ocean for hours, methodically circling along foreign borders. Its range and efficiency in cruise mode are not the same. It is a different tool for a different task, and the task of patrolling hasn't gone anywhere. Then came the 1990s, and that's when truly difficult times arrived for the Bear. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991. The country that created this plane, that built the entire system of basing, crew training, and maintenance for it, that country was gone. The Russian Air Force in the 1990s was in deep crisis. Not enough fuel, not enough spare parts, not enough money for basic maintenance. Planes stood on the ground for months. Crews lost their qualifications. Entire aviation regiments existed only on paper. Strategic patrolling over the oceans effectively stopped. Simultaneously, negotiations on strategic arms reduction treaties were underway. Part of the fleet was subject to destruction under these treaties. In Ukraine, where a significant part of the Soviet strategic aviation park was located, the Tu-95s were cut with autogenous torches right on the airfields. Sometimes in the presence of American inspectors who methodically photographed the process. It seemed, that's it. Here is the real end. In 1994, a high-ranking military official stated in an interview with a major publication that the Tu-95 would be completely retired within the next 5 years. Outdated, inexpedient. The era is over. That official has long since retired. The Tu-95 is still flying. Because in the mid-2000s, something happened that completely changed the situation. Russia was rebuilding its economy, its military budget, and its ambitions regarding presence in world airspace. In 2007, strategic patrolling was officially resumed after a nearly 15-year hiatus. And the first ones to fly again were the Bears. Not because there were no others, because they were the ones ready for this job. Because they were created specifically for this task. Long, methodical routes over oceans. And in this, they have no equals. Here is the right time to talk about money, because the financial side of this story is no less interesting than the technical one. Creating a new strategic plane is not just expensive, it is prohibitively expensive. The American B-2 Spirit cost about $2 billion per unit. That is not a typo. $2 billion for one plane. Development, testing, production. Altogether, it runs into tens of billions. The Tu-95 is already built, already paid for, already refined down to the last bolt. A deep modernization of an existing plane costs several times, if not orders of magnitude, less than creating a new one. New avionics, new navigation systems, new communication systems, new weaponry, all this can be put on a proven airframe to get a machine that meets modern requirements. This is not a Soviet peculiarity. This is universal logic. The American B-52 Stratofortress took to the air for the first time in 1952, the same year as the Tu-95. They are literally the same age. The B-52 is officially in service with the U.S. Air Force, flies regularly, and according to latest estimates, should remain in service until 2050. Until the year 2050. This means that a plane created in the year Stalin was still alive will be flying in a year when most people reading these lines will be old folks, or won't be reading at all. Think about this scale. Both machines, the Bear and the B-52, survived all the technological revolutions of the second half of the 20th century. The jet revolution, the computer revolution, the precision-guided weapons revolution, the stealth technology revolution. They survived, and they continue to fly. Because the mission they were created for hasn't gone away. Because endurance and range are not outdated characteristics. They are eternal requirements for a certain class of machines. And because some things are done so correctly the first time, that redoing them is simply pointless. But from the outside, the Bear still looks like a plane from another era. Massive fuselage, huge blades, angular lines. Not a hint of modern aerodynamics. Look inside, and the picture changes sharply. Let's forget for a moment about strategy, about patrolling, about intercepts and treaties. Let's talk about the human, a specific human. Let's call him Sergei, a composite image from dozens of real recollections of veterans who flew the Tu-95 for thousands of hours. Morning. An airfield somewhere in the north. The temperature outside is -20. Sergei zips up his flight suit, checks his gear, and looks at his plane. Huge. Dark against the gray sky. Steam from the warming engines rises into the frosty air. Today they are flying for about 18 hours, maybe 20. The route, over the Atlantic, along the Norwegian coast, turn, back. Sergei adjusts his earplugs and climbs the ladder. Because without earplugs, there's no point in being there. Literally. The noise level in the Tu-95 crew cabin in cruise mode is about 90 decibels. It's like standing next to a running lawnmower. Constantly. 18 hours straight. Veterans who flew it for 20-30 years almost all have characteristic professional hearing loss. This isn't a complaint, it's just a fact. Part of the profession, like calluses on a carpenter. The crew of a standard Tu-95 MS is 7 people. Pilot and co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, weapons operator, radio operator, flight technician. Everyone knows their place, their duties, their route in this long iron body. The cabin by the standards of planes from 70 years ago is quite functional. By the standards of modern airliners, where passengers complain about insufficiently wide seats, it's Spartan. Instrument panels, switches, levers. Everything is mechanical, everything understandable, everything repairable in field conditions. No touchscreens. No artificial intelligence. Human and machine directly, without intermediaries. The first 3 hours are work routine, climbing, hitting the route, ground communication by protocol, data exchange. Then, cruise mode. And that's when we start talking about something not written in technical descriptions. 18 hours is a very long time. You've probably flown on long-haul flights, 10 to 12 hours to somewhere like Bangkok or New York. Remember that feeling at the end of the flight? Cramped legs, heavy head, the desire to be on the ground at any cost. Now add to this a constant roar at 90 decibels. Remove the ability to stand up and walk around the cabin. Remove the flight attendant with a cart. Leave a thermos of tea and a ration pack that's packed so it doesn't spill in any turbulence. That is life inside the bear. And yet, and this is where something important begins, veterans who spent years of their lives on the Tu-95 speak about it with an intonation hard to miss. Not just as a machine, as something you get used to, the same way you get used to the character of an old friend. With all its quirks, all its demands, all its noise. One of them recalled it roughly like this. The first flights? Unbearable. Noise, vibration, sitting for a long time. You want to jump out. And then? And then you start to hear separate voices in that noise. This engine is a little different. Here the vibration is slightly stronger. You start to understand the plane. Like you understand a person you live with for a long time. This isn't romanticism. It's a profession. Navigation on long-range routes is a separate chapter. In the era before GPS existed, crews worked with celestial navigation. The navigator, with a sextant, looked at the stars through a special hatch, literally at the stars, like sailors centuries ago, and determined the plane's coordinates by their position. In the 20th century, on a strategic bomber, by the stars. There is something here that makes you stop and think. In modern modifications, of course, all this is replaced by satellite systems and digital avionics. But veterans remember that time and say there was dignity in it. You had to think, calculate, understand where you were, not because a screen shows you, but because you figured it out. Sleeping in flight is a separate chapter. On ultra-long routes, the crew works in shifts. While some work, others doze right in their seats or on small folding bunks in the rear. Not a deep sleep, more like that half-oblivion an experienced person knows how to catch in any conditions. To the accompaniment of 90 decibels. And so they return, 20 hours behind them. The landing gear touches the runway. Engines drop revs. One veteran described it like this. He stepped out of the plane after a particularly long flight and just stood on the ground for a few minutes. Didn't go anywhere, just stood. Because the silence was physically palpable. Not silence in the sense of absolute void. An airfield is an airfield. But after 20 hours of continuous NK-12 roar, the usual airfield noise seemed like total silence. Soft, almost tangible, as if it could be picked up in your hands. He stood and felt it with his skin, then went to the debriefing. That is the real Tu-95. Not the one in parade photos in the sky over Red Square. Not the one in shots with NATO interceptors. But this one, where 7 people sit for 18 hours in a roaring iron body over an endless dark ocean and do their job. Methodically, professionally, without extra words. And now, about what was happening with this plane on the outside while the crews worked on the inside. Because the bear flying today is not at all the plane that took to the air in 1952. On the outside, similar. On the inside, a completely different story. Imagine an old house. Outside, the brick has blackened with time. Shingles replaced in places. The chimney is slightly crooked. A passerby looks and thinks, well, old junk. Probably dark inside, damp, floorboards creaking. He walks in. Warm light, modern kitchen, smart home with voice control, climate control, fiber optic internet, designer furniture. Outside, 19th century. Inside, 21st. That is roughly what happened with the Tu-95 MS, the last and most deeply modernized version of the bear. And when I say deeply, I mean so deeply that engineers sometimes argued, is this even the same plane? Let's break it down by layers, literally, from nose to tail. Let's start with what remained unchanged, the airframe. Structural elements, main spars, wing longerons, center section. This is the skeleton of the plane, and it is made so well that there is simply no reason to change it. Soviet metallurgists and designers in the early 1950s calculated safety margins with such generosity that this skeleton will outlive several more generations of avionics. The NK-12 engines. They remained. As we said, there's nothing to replace them with. There's nothing that would give such power with such fuel efficiency in the same dimensions. The engines regularly undergo major repairs. Individual components are replaced with more modern ones, but the concept itself, the architecture of the NK-12, remains untouched. And the general aerodynamic scheme. Swept back wings, 4 engines in pods, the characteristic landing gear layout. It's a silhouette that hasn't changed in 70 years. And now, what changed? And this is where it gets interesting. First, navigation and communication. The old Tu-95 navigated using astronomical observations, radio navigation systems, and, frankly, a fair share of the navigator's professional art. It worked, but accuracy was plus minus a few kilometers. On the Tu-95 MS stand modern inertial navigation systems and integrated satellite navigation receivers. Accuracy, meters, not kilometers, meters. The plane, created in the era when the first artificial satellite hadn't yet been launched, today uses satellites for navigation with an accuracy that the original designers never dreamed of. Communication systems, completely new. Protected digital channels. Ability to work on all modern military frequencies. Equipment for scrambling communications. Technologies that simply didn't exist in 1952. Stand in a plane born in 1952. Second, radar equipment. The original Tu-95 had an onboard radar, quite decent for its time. But for its time is exactly the disclaimer that changes everything. Cold War tech was created for Cold War tasks. On the Tu-95 MS stands fundamentally different radar equipment. New target detection systems. New electronic intelligence means. The plane can not only fly from point A to point B, but also collect a huge amount of information about radar and electronic systems it encounters on the route. Each flight over foreign waters is not just a demonstration of presence, it is an intelligence mission. Silent, methodical, very attentive. Third, the cockpit. Here, the transformation is perhaps the most noticeable to anyone who has seen both the original and the modern version. The old cabin is hundreds of separate instruments, dial indicators, mechanical gauges, analog dials. Each instrument, its own function, its own place, its own logic. To read all this simultaneously, years of training were needed. Pilots literally memorized the location of every instrument by automation, because in a critical situation, you had to look instantly and accurately. In the modern cockpit of the Tu-95MS, multifunctional displays. Not on the entire panel, not everywhere. The plane still retains a significant part of analog instruments as backups. But key information is now displayed on digital screens that can be reconfigured for the current task. This fundamentally changes the load on the crew. Less time reading instruments, more on decision-making. Fourth, and here I ask you to stop and think for real. Armament. The original Tu-95 was created as a carrier, a delivery platform. Its task was simple to the point of rigidity. Fly there, drop, return. Everything it carried was determined by the technologies of its era. The Tu-95MS carries KH-101 cruise missiles. Let's talk about what that means. The KH-101 is a cruise missile with a range of application, by various estimates from 4 to 5,000 kilometers. It flies at low altitude, terrain following. Its accuracy is within a few meters. It is equipped with radar cross-section reduction systems. Let's translate into imagery. The Tu-95, while over neutral waters, that is, without crossing anyone's state borders, while being in fully international space, is capable of deploying a missile that will reach a target thousands of kilometers away and hit it with meter-level accuracy. A plane over 70 years old carries missiles under its wing created in the 21st century. And now, that very moment that changes the entire perception. There are estimates by specialists according to which some Tu-95MS units carry systems under their wings designed and produced later than the interceptor planes that shadow them. That is, the old bear carries technology under its wing newer than the iron of those chasing it. Think about this picture. A British Typhoon, built in the early 2000s, flies alongside a Tu-95 whose airframe was made in the 1980s, but whose missiles under the wing are of yesterday's manufacture. Who is the old one here? Fifth, electronic warfare systems. On modern Tu-95MS, electronic countermeasures are installed. Systems that create interference for foreign radars. Warning systems of being illuminated. The plane understands when it's targeted. Decoy deployment systems. This means the bear, which doesn't hide, which screams its presence to the entire world with its engines, is at the same time equipped with means that significantly complicate the task for anyone who decides to move from shadowing to something more. Loud, but not defenseless. Now let's put it all together. Take the airframe and engines of the 50s. Add 21st century navigation. Add modern communication and intelligence systems. Add digital avionics. Add missiles with a range of thousands of kilometers and meter-level accuracy. Add electronic warfare. What do you get? You get a machine that has no direct equivalent in the world. No one else has a turboprop strategic plane of such range, such endurance, with such a suite of modern systems on board. The B-52 is a close analog, but a jet. Everything else is fundamentally different classes. The Tu-95MS occupies a unique niche, and that is exactly why it is impossible to just take it and replace it. Not because there is no money, not because there is no technology, but because creating a replacement means creating something fundamentally new in its class, from scratch, without experience, without proven solutions. This takes decades, and costs not just expensive, prohibitively expensive. It is simpler and smarter to keep investing in what is already flying, what is already proven, what is already understood down to the last bolt. The ship of Theseus of the aviation world. The question of whether this is the same plane that took off in 1952 becomes almost philosophical. Technically, much has changed, but the soul, the character, the idea itself remain the same. And it is this idea, endurance is more important than speed, presence is more important than invisibility, reliability is more important than perfection, that deserves a separate, final discussion. Because the Bear long ago stopped being just a plane. It became a question. A philosophical question about what it means to be outdated. And about whether anything that is done correctly becomes outdated at all. There is a question I want to ask you directly. What does it mean to be outdated? Not for a person, for an idea, for a machine, for a solution that someone invented long ago, and which still works better than everything invented afterward. We live in an era obsessed with novelty. Every year, a new phone model. Every few years, a new generation of tech. Everything previous is automatically declared outdated, irrelevant, subject to replacement. We are so used to this rhythm that we began to consider it a law of nature. But nature doesn't work that way. The shark hasn't changed fundamentally for 350 million years. Not because evolution stopped, but because the shark solved the problem of survival in its environment so well that there was nothing to improve. Any change would make it worse, not better. The Tu-95 is the shark of aviation. Not in the sense of aggression, in the sense of form perfection for a specific function. Tupolev and his team in the early 1950s found the solution to the task: maximum endurance, maximum range, the ability to carry a significant load over huge distances. And they found it so accurately that 70 years later, this solution is still unsurpassed. This is not nostalgia. This is an engineering fact. But let's talk about something more than engineering. There are several machines in human history that cross the border between technology and symbol. They exist not only as functional objects, they exist as statements, as points of view on the world. The Willys Jeep, which stormed mountain roads during World War II, and whose straight lines and minimalist silhouette spawned a whole class of vehicles, still recognizable in any modern SUV. The Kalashnikov, whose mechanics are so simple and reliable that it works in conditions where any more complex device would fail. Its concept hasn't changed for 70 years, only materials and details. The B-52, which took to the air the same year as the Bear, and which the US Air Force plans to operate until 2050, literally until the middle of the 21st century. All these machines share one thing. Their creators were solving a problem, not chasing an image of the future. They thought about what needed to be done, not how it should look, and as a result, created something that turned out to be timeless. This is a very rare quality, and very valuable. Now I want to tell you something I thought about while preparing this material. We live in a world that is considered incredibly complex. Technologies develop faster than we have time to comprehend them. Systems become smarter, thinner, more sophisticated. Stealth planes that no radar can track. Drones controlled by artificial intelligence. Hypersonic missiles that change trajectory in flight. And in the middle of all this, the Bear. Loud. Noticeable. With propellers 6 meters in diameter that churn the air with a sound audible for 40 kilometers. It doesn't hide. It doesn't try to be invisible. It does the exact opposite. It announces itself so loudly that this in itself becomes a tool. And you know what? It works. Every time the Bear appears over the North Sea or along the shores of Alaska, interceptors scramble. Phones ring. Procedures start. Headquarters go into motion. One plane, 70 years of age, forces a huge military machine to work just by the fact of its presence. An invisible plane flies by unnoticed. The Bear flies by, and everyone knows about it. Which of these is more effective as a message is a big question. There is a concept in architecture: honest construction. When a building doesn't hide what it's made of, when beams are visible, when brick isn't plastered, when the form speaks directly to function. Such buildings often live longer than fashionable ones because they have nothing superfluous, nothing to become morally outdated, nothing to go out of fashion. The Tu-95 is honest construction. Everything is visible in it. 4 huge engines, Here they are, in plain sight. Massive blades. Here they are, spinning. Massive fuselage. Here it is. No aerodynamic elegance for the sake of elegance. Every element is here because it's needed. Nothing extra. And it is this honesty, one of the reasons why it lives so long. But I want to end not with technical reasoning. I want to end with an image. Somewhere, over a dark northern ocean, right now, while you are listening to this, a Tu-95 is likely flying. Its navigation lights are blinking in the dark. Below the wing, thousands of meters of cold air and even colder water. Ahead, hours of travel. Inside, 7 people. They are drinking tea from thermoses, talking over the intercom, making notes in the logbook. One dozed off on a folding bunk in the rear. Outside, night, stars, a horizon that doesn't change for hours. And that very sound. Remember what we started with? North Sea. 2 pilots in an interceptor cockpit. They hear it before they see it. Deep, pulsing, unparalleled hum, as if the sky itself started to vibrate. This sound rang in 1952 over Soviet airfields when the plane was just taking its first steps. It rang in 1961 over Novaya Zemlya. It rang over all the oceans of the planet during the years of the great confrontation of 2 eras. It rang in the 90s when it seemed all was over. It rang in 2007 when the bear returned. It rings now, and, in all likelihood, will ring for a very long time. Because some things are done so correctly, so accurately, so honestly, so in accordance with what is actually needed, that time just doesn't know what to do with them. It tests them for strength, again and again. And they fly. Tu-95 Bear, 70 years in the sky. A living legend that doesn't intend to become history. At least, not yet. If you found this interesting, share this video with someone who, you think, will also like it. Not for the algorithms, but just because good stories deserve to be heard. See ya.